Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Future for the Future. Joining me today is Tim Delouchrey, the Director of Operations at the Blue Lab, and we are going to be talking about the future of progressive campaigning in American politics. Tim, hello.
Hello, thank you for having me. I am super excited to be here.
Well, very excited to have you here. So let's just jump straight into this. Since I'm an amazing researcher for these podcasts, the Blue Lab describes itself on its website as a political incubator that is revolutionizing progressive political campaigns and the next generation of candidates and campaigners. So what does this mean? What is the Blue Lab? And what on earth is going on?
Yeah, to be credit to your research skills, that's really all that's out there. The opportunity is so unique, and whenever we're talking to new folks who want to join the team or new candidates, it always requires a good bit of explanation. But yeah, to take it from the top, there was a problem that was thought to be solved. The problem is, if you're trying to get campaign experience as a young person, there are plenty of doors to be open. The unfortunate part is behind those doors is just like endless making phone calls to random voters, knocking on doors when we're not in a pandemic. Good skills to have, but skills you can learn in like 48 hours and be pretty good at. So what the Blue Lab sought to do was to, expand the depth of experience that a student could have in an industry in particular, like electoral politics, where you're essentially running a new campaign every 2 years. You're setting them up like 8 months before. You're hiring on staff 6 months before election day. It makes no sense to have to train people for 90 days or whatever, right? To really get to a level of proficiency needed to be on a winning campaign. So what the Blue Lab tries to do is provide students with an in-depth education to campaign politics well in advance of being a professional staffer. That way, when they go on to work on campaigns, they're starting a leg up, a huge leg up. And, the eventual goal is to have Republicans saying, where did the Democrats get all these amazing staffers that are 24 years old and are like working Senate campaigns in swing states and whatnot, right? And so that's the goal, or at least that's part of the goal. The other part of the goal stemmed from that, which is we're going to be training all these really bright students to be working on campaigns, and if they're getting really good at it, we might as well put that bandwidth to good use. And so we work for candidates who have been historically disadvantaged and underrepresented in U.S. electoral politics, which, as I'm sure plenty of your viewers know, is pretty much every group that's not like an old white guy. So we work for a ton of first-time candidates, female candidates, minority candidates, candidates with disabilities. I think, even today we see like a horribly low number of elected officials have had experience living with disabilities. And that's, it's shocking to me that that's like a new frontier of a group that we're trying to get elected, and it's 2020. So we're taking all this bandwidth that we're essentially creating and we're putting it to good use. And it creates this ecosystem where folks are working on the campaigns, they're learning from the campaigns, they're learning from the staff at the Blue Lab, and they're enhancing the campaigns. And it's cyclical. When you're working for a first-time candidate, it's a lot of, town and city and state races, which is where everybody gets started, right? And so, Barack Obama started on a state Senate campaign, and I was reading his new book the other day, and the way he describes it is like 3 people in a room smoking a bunch of cigarettes being like, don't worry about policy, Barack. And shockingly, like that's the level of bandwidth all these campaigns have.
Sounds like fun to me.
It sounds like a good time. And I'm shocked he won. But the Blue Lab is trying to add another layer of depth to first-time campaigns so they can look like the ones that have the advantages of old money and of old connections.
So let's talk about some of the success stories of the Blue Labs. When you go onto the website, some of the names that come up are Tram Nguyen, Seth Moulton, Andy Vargas. When you look back, what are some of the the best examples of sort of the Blue Lab success in campaigning and elections?
Yeah, so I'll go with a recency bias here, just because it's some of the races that are more fresh in my mind. But we see this all over the state, and we're in Massachusetts mostly. We're working on expanding other places, which I know we'll talk a little bit about later. But in Massachusetts, which is a blue state, a Democratic state, a liberal state through and through, less than 30% of elected officials are women. This is insane, right? I mean, it's a state that really prides itself on leadership and representation, and yet we have this horrible statistic. And so it's anything but funny, but funny, I guess, is the word we use when, we're working with a candidate who is running for a district where they would be like the first woman to ever represent the district, or, maybe the first Black American to represent a majority Black district or something like that. And so again, we'll go with recency bias. Brandy Fluker Oakley is a candidate we worked with this past cycle. Brandy was a practicing lawyer, a former teacher. She's whip smart, just a complete technocrat. After we got out of our first meeting with her, we were like, this woman sounds like Elizabeth Warren. Like, she has a plan for everything. She's phenomenal. She's detail oriented. And so she was running for state rep in, it's a few areas, and we won't drill too much into it, but a southern area of Boston in a majority Black district. And it had always been represented by a white person. The former rep, to his credit, was quite good. And the one before him, to his discredit, was very corrupt and actually found ways to kind of realign the district so that he could have gerrymandering to get more white people in it, right? So these races, no matter how small, take on a really deep historical context, right? Brandy was able to win the race, which she was, and we'll talk a little bit about how exciting that was and whatnot. She's going to be the first Black woman to represent a district that is majority Black. And it's insane that it takes so long to get to these things. And the reality of it is, there are just so many barriers for first-time candidates. Can you raise money? That stops most people. Over 90% of candidates lose, right? Keep that in mind. Can you raise money? That's always hard. Can you talk to the right people? There's such a hesitation to support new people in politics in general. You don't want to upset the decision makers. If it's in a primary, I think, should I explain primary, or is that?
I think we're fine.
Awesome. If it's in a primary, I think people are often, up for saying, we'll let the party figure it out. We'll let the party voters figure it out, and then we'll just support whoever it is that we think is going to win the general. And none of this is useful to enacting actual change, right? This is all just people betting on the winner when the outcome is already decided, right? So with Brandy, we put in a ton of effort to trying to help her raise money. And to her credit, she is a prolific fundraiser and did a phenomenal job. And a lot of that is just in her pitch. I think in one conversation with her, as we found, you can tell she's going to be great at the job. And so, identifying that kind of talent and then putting as much bandwidth as we can behind it with no reservation for, are we going to upset anybody if we do this? Are there any, political decision makers and power holders that are going to be like, hey, stop, we don't care. And because that is what stops so many of these campaigns from getting off the ground, is there's, just the slightest bit of the powers that be don't want this, and so we can't do it. That's the most recent one that's really on my mind. Happy to expand on more, but
sure. So talk about like sort of the barriers to entry there, and getting over these initial challenges for someone who's brand new in this. What, in the day-to-day practice, what practically does the Blue Lab do? Is it just like having more boots on the ground, or is it, building infrastructure from the ground up? What is the sort of process that the team goes through?
Yeah, so there's kind of the deal that's made when a candidate hires the Blue Lab, and that's that they're committing to the Blue Lab's mission, right? Which is to give students experience beyond your traditional like door knocking and phone banking. And again, I don't want to belittle those things. They are essential to winning campaigns, especially local races where you need like 900 votes to win. Making 1,800 phone calls means a lot in that instance. That said, part of the deal is that they're going to be providing us with, interesting tasks, things that will prepare the students to be actual staffers in the future, not just volunteers. And so it can really range. There are 4 buckets, essentially, we operate under. So we're talking communications, fundraising, field, and political outreach. Those are the 4 umbrellas, so to speak, under which we do all sorts of things. So to really briefly touch into them, it's really whatever a given candidate wants. Sometimes we'll do all fundraising. Sometimes we'll do a little bit of everything. Sometimes people will come to us and say, I think I'd make a great elected official. We agree. They say, I don't even know how to file papers to run for office. And this is so good. Like, it's not like an easy thing to just know off the top of your head. So in instances like that, we'll really do the whole campaign. But to dive into the buckets a little bit, fundraising, this is like, a lot of data, a lot of who do we expect we'll give to the campaign, digging up contact info, preparing candidates to ask for money. I will never run for office in my life, and that is because, and I think this is why most people decide not to, the first thing you have to do is like call your family members and ask if they'll give you a bunch of money that, they may or may not have. And that is so awkward. And so it's a big, kind of mental support session for the candidate a lot of the time too, that what you're doing is okay, it's normal. So that's fun. That's fundraising, a ton of research, a ton of helping candidates just have enough to do things, right? The other part is field. Field is a lot of tracking your volunteers, building out walk maps, stuff like that. Everything that, like, when volunteers show up to knock on doors or make phone calls, somebody has gone through and decided who are the people whose doors we're going to knock on, whose phones we're going to call.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the higher level strategy stuff, stuff that if you want to get into political consulting or something like that, that's stuff you would know. So we do a lot of that. Communication is my favorite. That's like writing press releases, doing people's social media accounts, crafting the narrative of the campaign in general, writing any kind of remarks, etc. And there's a lot of like the boring details that go into it, but the crafting the narrative is really cool. And then political outreach, which is like, who do you need to talk to be successful in a given district? Who can we put you in touch with? Who are some good friends to have? Who are some good endorsements to go after? And all of this stuff, it's not something you can Google, which I think is a bummer for a lot of first-time candidates, is that you need to have your foot in the door to be able to even know what I just said. And it's maddening to me because it's not hard to know. It's just stuff that, people aren't circulating around. And so what we're trying to do is get more people armed with the information they need.
You mentioned, so people will come to you of, not without any knowledge of how to get into the political system, how to file these forms, for example. Do you know cases where, not only has someone come to you without the political processing knowledge, but even the knowledge of how to operate like a social media account, something like, or even how to make an attractive website that people will be able to search? Had someone come to you with just such a high barrier to entry that they don't even understand these sorts of things?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, that's like, it's almost the most common thing that people actually kind of contract us out for. Or have us help out with is, hey, I've been trying to put together a Facebook page. It has 7 likes and I have no idea how to get to 8, let alone like the 2,000 I want to end up at. And so, these are things that young people are just really inherently good at. And that's not to say there's not like also a deep science and logic behind it, because there is. But, it's so appealing, I think, to these candidates who for the first time are like I've never built a website before. I mean, not until I was at the Blue Lab, at least, right? But there was a lot of training involved in that. And so when you run for office and someone's like, oh, is your website up and running? There's no correlation whatsoever between somebody who would be a good policymaker and somebody who can build a good website. And it's not criticism. It's just completely different disciplines. And so you shouldn't have to worry about that as a candidate, right? As a candidate, you should worry about 3 things: talking to voters. It does not involve building a website. Raising money, which is a bummer, and I wish we had different laws so that wasn't a big deal. And then the third is what you're going to do when you're in office, right? Those are the 3 things you should worry about. You should not be worrying about how to code on WordPress. You should not be worrying about like Facebook's algorithm. You should not be worrying
what
about
hashtags to put on my tweets.
Exactly. Yeah. This is all stuff that, someone who's close to the campaign, politically interested, can do. And that's where we find a lot of our young folks have a huge advantage, is that they enjoy thinking about these things. They're really good at thinking about these things. Again, it's not simple. Ed Markey was a Senate candidate in Massachusetts. Our parent company worked for him. We didn't, but he won a really intense primary election. And his social media game was so commendable.
Yeah.
And a lot of it just seemed crazy out there. There were accounts like Ketchup Bottles for Ed Markey, which created the Markeyverse, as they called it, which was pretty much a series of memes that got a ton of young people interested. And their volunteer base by the end of the campaign, when it mattered, was huge, because so many college students, high school students, people with the time to make phone calls were interested, because that was a campaign that spoke to young people. So it's not easy. It's not as simple as making ketchup bottles for candidate X, but there's a middle ground to be found, and they were able to do that.
I think we've cracked it. I'm just gonna spam a bunch of Twitter accounts, make Hugh president of world, and it's gonna work. No, so I think obviously the Blue Lab is the majority is comprised of students. How different is the Blue Lab from like traditional campaign groups? What really makes the Blue Lab stand out from your more, I guess, traditional campaign groups that people might turn to?
I would say it's a completely different offering. So our parent company is a political consulting firm, and they're not competition because we work together. But even in that sense, the rates you have to pay for an American political consultant is very high. And a lot of that comes with a lot of logic. These are people who bill at high hours because they're very good at what they do, right? And that's all great. But if you're running for state representative in Massachusetts, it's your first time, you're going to raise like $40,000. you're probably not paying $5,000 a month for a consultant, right? Because that won't even last the whole race, let alone allow you to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So what the Blue Lab is it's part consulting because, we certainly have industry professionals on staff who can help with stuff, but those industry professionals are in the background. And that's what justifies the very low cost of candidates for the Blue Lab is it's student interfacing. So you're purchasing a ton of bandwidth for a very low rate and ingenuity and innovative ideas, right? When the pandemic hit, we were in the middle of a signature collecting process in the US to get on the ballot. One of our candidates needed 1,000 signatures for a race that like nobody really pays much attention to, and it's very hard to do non-pandemic times. You pretty much just camp out at like Democratic town meetings and whatnot. You're like, hey, please, and you get to your 1,000 right by the finish line. We couldn't even be outside and talk to people to do it. And so the advantage the Blue Lab has is, in times where weird things come up, and weird things come up all the time in the realm of politics, they're not kind of trapped by like this old way of thinking. The old way of thinking is very valuable very often. There's no denying that. But there's a bend towards innovation, which is nice. And so with our candidate, we, brainstormed up this whole process where we're going to mail people individually the signature sheets, follow-up call, beg them, all that. And it worked. We got well over 1,000 signatures. And other campaigns did this for sure, but I also heard other people say it might not look like you're able to run this year. And that would have been a terrible call, not for this candidate in particular, but for another who needed the same number of signatures that I'm kind of thinking back to. But, you got to try something new at a certain point, right? If every consultant is using the same ideas on every side, it's hard to break out.
Generally, we've gone into this a bit. Like the campaigns the Blue Lab focused on, are highly localized. So, anything from like state senate to 11th district fire council or whatever. Or like I think
dog catchers, the joke we usually use. Yeah.
How difficult is it to navigate so many different and highly specific, campaigns? How difficult is it to sort of navigate these very different environments in campaigning?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So there are kind of a few things you have to ask yourself when you're running for a different seat and how much does it change the campaign. The core components of it do not change much. You're trying to raise as much money as you can so you can talk to enough, as many voters as you can to give your pitch, which is as good as it can be. That is at like none of that was helpful, but it made sense level of what you have to do on a campaign.
Sure.
Right?
You have to win. It's still the same. Don't worry.
You have to get more votes than the other. I'm not sure if you've heard, but right, that's what you're trying to do. And those principles apply across every race, and they actually guide a lot of what you do. There are things that are kind of hyper-localized that change that. If you're running for the school committee, nobody cares what you think about access to abortion or like some hot ticket national issue. If you're running, actually, this is a bad one. I was going to say if you're running for city council, nobody cares about your views on global climate change. It's actually not true anymore. Now, there's bike lanes, there's incentives for less cars to be on the road, stuff like that. So
I guess like foreign policy.
Foreign policy, great. Yeah, if you are running for state rep in Massachusetts, you have no say in that kind of stuff, right? So there are certain issues that will guide what you're doing. There's also kind of like a legislative position versus an executive position, right? If you're running for a legislative position, your job is to be an organized, professional, and very smart advocate, right? Because you're trying to get people to sign onto your agenda and create a movement within the elected body to pass something. If you're running for like mayor or, the Blue Lab doesn't do governor campaigns, but gubernatorial, but if we did, if you're running for governor, it's an executive position. You're trying to show that you can manage, right? And it's a little different than having, this awesome, intense agenda. So those are kind of the things you're distinguishing. The biggest thing is the district. I mean, that is, especially with local races, when you zoom in to a ward seat in a town where, 1,600 people are going to vote, if there's even like one company in that town that employs 1,000 people, like, we had a race in Braintree, and this didn't happen, but what could have, I suppose, is one of our candidates worked at the Dunkin' Donuts corporate office. And so like this office that employed so many people, right? And so it didn't get to this. My point is, if 80 of your constituents work for the same company, you're all of a sudden even like looking at a different thing. You're talking about different issues, right? All of this is affected, especially in these hyper local races. If everybody's at the same train station in one district, you're talking about that train station, right? And that we actually see a ton here in Massachusetts because our transportation infrastructure leaves a lot to be desired, to say the least. Though we don't notice much anymore because nobody goes to work. So,
how difficult is it to try and sort of like as an outside, I guess, campaigning force to almost like break into these communities? You know, some of them are so small, it's like only 1,000 people voting. I don't know, maybe this is a bit of a British person looking at America view, but like I have to admit, I see every small American town as like an Amish like village. That is my view. No, but like, how difficult it is to sort of really get an understanding for what people care about on the ground. You know, particularly I guess in the COVID age, we can't literally canvas.
Yes, that is actually the perfect question. A quick anecdote about the Amish towns. When I was a sophomore in college, my friend and I for spring break wanted to do something we wouldn't forget. That was our only barrier, which is terrible.
Yeah.
Do not make that your only criteria. So we walked from our houses, which is in the eastern part of Massachusetts, all the way to the university that's like in the westernmost part. It was like, I forget, 70 something miles. I don't know. It took us like 3 days. But to your point, we walked through a lot of towns that made me think, I didn't even know these existed. In Massachusetts, like one of the more densely populated states. And I was like, wow, I couldn't even pretend to think about what the 350 people of this town like are particularly interested in, right? It's a bizarre thing. And to your point, we can't really canvass. So that removes a lot of it because what you hear on the doors is kind of what you're generally using as your baseline. And then all scientific options are out the door, right? Polling, at least, you know, where we're from, polling runs you at quite the cost. Like one very good poll, and I actually think they're worth it. I think that any candidate who's raising enough money to pay for them absolutely should. I know polling is under a lot of fire right now. I am here as a fierce defender of polling. This is one of the things I'm more passionate about. But polling is super expensive. Again, if you're raising 30 grand for the whole campaign, you are not spending half to 2/3 of your budget on a thing that's going to tell you how to contact the voters that you can't afford to reach out to anymore, right? So, you know, you're not doing this for like races you're not raising a lot. And so you don't know what people are thinking, which is why it's important that, you know, while the Blue Lab is doing work in the background and is supporting the campaign, it is the candidate and a local team that really knows best how to talk to the community, especially people who have been in the community for a long time. We were working a race in one of the, it's technically Boston proper, but it's a neighborhood. It has like a different name. We were like, what do people care about? And they were debating whether or not we should do a poll because this race was raising a bit more money. And one of the staffers was like, I've lived here for 30 years. People just think rent's too high and that they can't get to work on time. And that was absolutely correct. It was the winning message. It was the only two things people cared about. And that's what you'll find a lot around the city here. But again, you're really relying on like community leaders. You're going to listening sessions. You're going to Democratic town meetings. A lot of these really hyper local races will have like a single issue. That's a huge deal, right? Because you know, there's like one new development in town. That's the only news there's been in 36 months. And so you know that's your wedge issue. And so you want to be on the right side of that, or at least be able to defend your position on it.
When going into one of these sort of campaigns, you know, you bring up polling there and you know how much you love it. What how I've got a flatmate you would love to talk to. Shout out to Matt. Speaking of, you should check out the podcast that's going to be in the corner of the screen right now. We talked about the election. It's about polling entirely. Anyway, no. So when going into one of these sort of, you know, localized campaigns, what is the balance between the numbers, the stats, the demographics that you see, and the sort of, I guess, like the feeling or the, you know, the knowledge of a local community, or sort of going, well, this is what they might care about. You know, how difficult is it to sort of balance these two, where you're like, well, numbers wise, we should be doing this, but then the candidate says, oh, trust me, this is where to go.
Yeah. So these are the moments where you try and talk the candidate out of whatever if it's a policy position, right? Like if we find out that, you know, is 75% of people in District X don't believe in climate change. That is not a reason for a Democratic candidate to be like, yeah, I don't know, it might not be real. That's, and this was, an optimistic feeling I had hoped was true in electoral politics. And I'm here to confirm that, at least for the candidates that we work with, these people who are really here to do well and give by their communities, that is true. If a candidate has a position that is deeply unpopular, you might try and rephrase how you say it so that it's a bit, easier for people to palate. You might, strengthen your argument.
Mm-hmm.
If you're arguing for something that a majority of the district disagrees with, there's not, an impossibility to change people's minds, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you are a fierce defender of a position, you stand by it. And so that's how you inform all your policy decision making. There are issues, if you believe in 10 things and we find out 3 of them people are crazy informed on and they love talking about, you're going to focus on those 3. That's kind of where, the needle is moved, so to speak. And then, thinking about the other side of the aisle, if there are these intense protests all across the country, hopefully that changes your mind on a given issue. You have to be a good listener at the end of the day. Yes, we're still hoping. But, then there's the strategic side of it where it's like, we know that the only thing you should be doing today is knocking on doors. And they're like, but there's this awesome parade I need to go to and everyone in town loves it. Like, well, nobody there is registered to vote. This is all hypothetical, by the way.
Yeah.
But these are moments where you're talking the candidate off the ledge. You're like, do not do that. We know it's not the best thing. And it's a balance you have to strike. And this is hard for young people in particular, I think, because, when my boss's boss says something to a campaign, they listen because he's been doing this for like 40 years. When I say something to a campaign, they sometimes listen because I've been doing this for a few years.
But if I said something to a campaign,
they're like, oh, well, we'll check with a few others. And so it's hard. It's a hard conversation to have. And, something a mentor of mine once said was, you should note every time the candidate says something that isn't right. And then you should look back and think, which one should I have pushed the needle on? And then, you've essentially saved up all of your goodwill. Like, this is the one thing I really think we should do differently. So you should be very careful about how you say things. And there's also the possibility that, we aren't right sometimes, right? There really are instances where someone's like, no, but my community is different. No, it's not. And in the end, it was. So, a lot of this is very difficult, again, with the availability of data just being not so great.
How important, obviously the Blue Lab focuses on, helping people who have been traditionally disenfranchised in politics, or, are first-time candidates, or, women, people of color, etc., disabled people. How important is it to try to support this sort of, new wave of candidates? How important is it to really, see this outcome?
Very. I've been fortunate enough to be doing work with both the Blue Lab and other organizations. So I've worked with more establishment candidates before, and it is much more of a breeze. It's like, we don't have to worry about thing XYZ. Like, we're kind of just chugging along.
Yeah.
It's very hard. People are resistant to change. That has been true throughout history. There are moments where, like, Barack Obama runs for president on the slogan of changing, and that was good for about a cycle. And then in 2010, Democrats lost every House seat you can imagine. So it's like, there are occasionally these windows where people are open for it, but what you really have to do is make the personal connection. And this is so hard, I think, for a lot of, like, candidates with loftier ideas sometimes struggle with, being told that the best thing you can do on a campaign is just, like, knock on someone's door and, like, ask how long it's been since the city has addressed the pothole at the top of the street, right? And that's where people are like, this is an issue that's close to me. This is an issue that, if I care about climate change, again, I should stop using this example because it really is locally important as well, but I'm going to use it for the sake of this example. If I care about climate change, I'm making sure Elizabeth Warren gets reelected, right? I'm not making sure that, my school committee met, right? Like, those are just,
sure.
They're my town councilor. For my town councilor, I care that they are accessible. I care that they're transparent. They answer my emails. I care that they fix the pothole at the top of my street. And that's not to, downplay the role of these local electeds, because while this is how you keep in touch with people, it's pretty much how you retain your seat so you can do, like, truly interesting stuff, like put in more bike lanes, put in better public transportation, all of these kind of loftier things that take a bit longer. But you really need to maintain a personal connection with your constituents.
Sure.
By far the number one thing.
Hmm. So on to now, money in politics, especially in America, is pretty much often considered to be one of, if not the largest problem in American politics, in the American political system. I study obviously U.S. politics in the UK, and I think about half our essays are why is the system bad, and the answer is normally money. Um, how does the Blue Lab, especially in such like small elections, help candidates with this issue? How does the Blue Lab sort of support candidates in the monumental task of fundraising?
Yeah. So there are kind of two ways to look at it. There's, sort of the question you're asking, and I'll get into it, which is why is this so like awful, and why does it create so many barriers, and
Mm-hmm.
why are we still doing it? That's, the first way you can look at it. The second way, which we're kind of forced to look at it through, is campaign finance law isn't going to change during the course of this campaign I'm on right now. So I have to work within the rules. I have to
Mm-hmm.
figure out how to do that in a way that, maybe it's not superior to my more well-funded opponent, but maybe it removes a weakness of mine, which I wasn't raising enough money to be viable. Maybe I don't have more money, but I have enough to be viable.
Sure.
So it's tough for local races in particular. If you're Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, your name recognition nationally, and I won't talk about percentages, but like just in terms of raw people who know who you are and
Mm-hmm.
can give $5 and like you're probably talking about tens of millions of people, right? It's that easy. Joe Biden,
Mm-hmm.
and the total is still climbing, has over 80 million people who voted for him, right? That is a crazy reach. You could ask $5 from all those people and you could run a pretty decent campaign. At the local level, it's different, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've got like, use a state rep race, for example. You've got like 9,000 people who are going to vote. You've got like 30,000 people who are in the district. Let's go back to the 9,000. Of those 9,000 that are going to vote, 5,000 know who you are. 3,000 have an opinion of you. 2,000 have a favorable opinion.
Mm-hmm.
100 can give money. 20 you can find contact info for, right? So it really comes down that quickly. And so in a local race, it's kind of a bummer, but you're pretty much forced to just find, 10 to 50 people who can give you the maximum amount, which in Massachusetts is $1,000 in a calendar year. So within the rules, that's what you have to work with. You're never going to create a big enough network that everybody's going to give you $20 and you're going to be okay. Unfortunately, right? It's more just focused on a few big donors, which is the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
But to your other point, is the system corrupt because of money? Yes, right? And I think there's so much transparency around this now. You have to report everybody who donates to you, what industry they work for, if it's over a given amount. And all of this helps, is it worth taking 10 million from fossil fuels in a presidential election if all of your opponents can then say you take, like, is that a $10 million mistake?
Mm-hmm.
Right? These are questions we're getting closer to being able to ask. That said, until more people are paying attention to your campaign finance records, it's always worth it to take the donation. And so that's when things get a little sticky. And it's not so much that you're taken into a room with a bunch of fossil fuel executives and they're like, hey, we have this money, we're going to give it to you as long as you say climate change
Mm-hmm.
isn't real, even though
Wafting
we
in front
both
of your
know that's
nose like a
wrong.
cartoon pie.
Yeah. It's more like, you're careful about the way you talk about things. You're not pushing to move the needle because you'd rather rely on that money than whatever issue. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a question of priorities. It is in a lot of ways why the system is corrupt. A lot of decisions are made just based on the next campaign. And it doesn't always have to do with money, but people are more focused on how their legislative record will be used against them in the campaigns than how their legislative record will be reflected in the community, right? And that's where you get into trouble. And that's why we like our candidates, because they haven't been like, exposed and drained by the swamp, so to speak, for years. They have fresh perspectives and ideas they want to capitalize on.
Mm-hmm. So we've gone a lot into sort of the model of the Blue Lab, what it does and how it does it. How far do you think this concept could go? Do you think this is something that could be, expanded across the entire country and really start to build a stronger sort of grassroots progressive campaigning? How far do you think that the concept of the Blue Lab could be expanded?
Yeah, so there are a few things so we've been in talks about expanding, and we, before COVID, we'd actually opened up in New Hampshire, South Carolina, and we were on our way to Wisconsin office, and all of that kind of took a back seat to the world collapsing, and we couldn't really do like the on the ground stuff anyway. So what we found in that limited experience, well, there are a few things to look for. The Blue Lab can essentially be anywhere that there aren't enough Democrats, or there are enough Democrats but poor representation, right?
Hmm.
That's thing one. Two, there are students around, so colleges. Boston perhaps has like the biggest advantage we could find in the whole country in terms of like so many colleges being within like
Hmm.
10 square miles, that when we were in person, we had no shortage of interns. We got tons of applicants, even when we could only open it to the city of Boston. Now that we're remote, that second part is almost less significant.
Hmm.
We can take people from anywhere. And so there doesn't need to be a college down the street. There just needs to be one on Earth. And that's a much bigger place. In some communities, though, and I think this is where we would want to flesh out, a future expansion, is
Hmm.
if we're going to be moving to like Georgia, a hot topic of American politics right now,
Hmm.
like Stacey Abrams said, we don't want people to move to Georgia. And Stacey Abrams is right. If I move to Georgia and I tell someone who's lived in Georgia for 14 years why a guy from Massachusetts, is telling them to vote for a Democrat, that just, it does not speak the same volumes. And these
Hmm.
things take years to build. So if you're going to expand elsewhere, you want to be involved with local experts. You want people who, we're here to serve, right? We don't want to come in and say, hey, we're going to Massachusettsify Georgia now, and we're going to do that because we have all this money and we don't care what you think. Like, it's more like you got to be listening to people, right?
Hmm.
You have to be getting in contact with someone in Georgia and saying, how can we help? Or how can we build something that you can use to help? Direct us. you know how to do this.
Hmm.
We're just here to provide bandwidth. And so, there needs to be a local flavor to it. And that's something we'll sort through as remote makes us less and less local, which
Hmm.
is a good and a bad thing in so many ways. But yeah, I,
Hmm.
I would say that's the new, kind of magic we're looking for,
Hmm.
is you need someone pseudo, at least sort of local.
See, that's one thing that I find phenomenally interesting about like American politics is how much every state and even their local districts are so like community focused, where it's someone coming from a different state and coming in and saying maybe you should vote for this person is ridiculous and almost insulting. But I almost think that's one of the benefits of the Blue Lab is like, let's say this was expanded to like so many different universities where students were, you've almost automatically got this strong local, I guess relation, because I think like especially thinking in British politics where it's like there's a real disconnect between your like political elite and your person who's going to end up voting. And yeah, I think that's just something that the Blue Lab has a real like insight into. Is sort of, well, these are people who've grown up here and live here and understand it, rather than, oh, I went to Oxford and or Harvard
Yeah.
and I know what gerrymandering is. Look at me.
A Harvard degree actually, despite like every politician in the US having a Harvard degree, actually polls terribly. And if you pay attention to it, when candidates have a Harvard degree and are running for office, they don't
Amazing.
mention it because it pisses people off. They're like,
Amazing.
you think you're better than me, and it's a whole thing. But yeah, a
Mhm.
Harvard degree, I found
Yeah.
out so funny, polls
Mhm.
terribly, like nationwide. Nobody wants you with
That's
a Harvard.
amazing.
They want you with a Harvard degree. They just don't want you to talk about it.
Yeah, that isn't that kind of like the a little bit like what Pete Buttigieg fell into, where it was like, oh, I worked at McKinsey or whatever, or like, and people were like, oh, you mean the one that fixed bread prices? And he was like, no, allegedly, no. Uh,
I have a friend who works at McKinsey in like an entry level position that I don't know what people did there, but it was like his entry level thing, right? Like he was like, he's probably like copy pasting PowerPoints to make sure the fonts match. Like it's the attacks like that that you're like totally vulnerable
Mhm.
to, and even if they're unfair, it's like, well, you kind of set it up yourself.
I mean, hey, on a utilitarian basis, maybe if he'd made those fonts not match, maybe they wouldn't have gone with the plan. Yada
Yeah, he could have
yada.
sabotaged.
Yeah,
Best way to
yeah.
make changes from the inside.
Oh,
Yeah,
there we go. Blue Lab
would have
model.
been a
There we
big
go.
play. Yeah.
So what can people expect from the Blue Lab in the upcoming? Well, I guess in the upcoming year, obviously COVID has really, I guess, slowed down or hit sort of the election dynamic. But what can people be expecting to see when they follow the socials at the Blue Lab on Twitter? Uh,
Continuing the pipeline. I think,
okay.
so there are a lot of pipelines in society that exist, and most of them are bad, right? It's just a connotation we have at this point. The Blue Lab is essentially trying to create a pipeline from people who would make very good elected officials to elected officials. And somehow, in our political system, which has so many rules and laws and history,
Mhm.
That doesn't exist. Like, that is just not, like, nobody cared to address that the politicians would be good at what they do, right? So that's what we're trying to do. Find people who represent their communities well and get them into office. So, if you're following the Blue Lab on social, you can expect to see a ton of updates about really fantastic candidates who, the trajectory is long for a lot of these folks, right? When one of our candidates wins, it's usually in some big upset because everyone's like, oh, that candidate has no chance. They're first time. They can't raise money.
Mhm.
What is this Blue Lab?
Who are
So
these
you can
people?
expect, yeah. And so when they win, it's news. And when you win and it's news your first time, your trajectory changes a little. It goes a little upwards, right? There are things you can do in the future, moves you can make because you've already established like a status as
Mhm.
somebody who's breaking norms and is breaking boundaries. So you can find a ton of updates about really cool and interesting candidates, people who we hope shape our future. A lot of opportunities to engage with the students too, whether it's, newsletters they're doing or projects they're engaging in or initiatives they're trying to start up. You can also find opportunities to apply and be a part of it. Always love that.
Amazing. Well then, Tim, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah,
If
thank
people
you.
do want to keep up with yourself and the Blue Lab, it's at Delouchrey Tim on Twitter. That's DELOUCHREY. If I'm good at editing, it'll be on screen now, but sometimes I'm not. No, and at the Blue Lab on Twitter, and the website is thebluelab.org. I'd recommend everyone to check these out. The links will also be in the description to go check that all out. Tim, thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for the plugs. Thanks for the good questions. Best of luck.
No problem at all. Thanks, everyone.